Well, great. Thank you for the introduction, Christian, and welcome to all of you. I'm very happy to see so many people here on this beautiful day. Of course, the assessment committee, very honored to have you here. And yeah, I will give you a lecture now, a 45-minute lecture, in defense of my PhD dissertation. And since creativity it's a broad concept, it's a fluffy concept in a lot of people's minds, very subjective meanings put forward to it. So I think it would be kind of a good idea to start by kind of setting it into context and talking about creativity in more general terms before getting more research specific. I will go through these different sections, so I'll go through kind of setting the context, then I will go through the introduction. I'll introduce the main theories behind my work, and then I'll go through the research and results. And since this was a 3-year study, combined or consisting of 6 different articles, there are a lot of results, so I won't go over all of them. I'll kind of pick out the ones that I think are most relevant and most interesting for you, the audience, today. And then I'll talk a bit, or kind of pinpoint the main contributions of my PhD, and talk a little bit about future directions. But as I said, creativity is this concept that a lot of people have a difficulty grasping what it is. So I thought I would start with an analogy. So here you have a picture of windmills, and I don't know why there are a lot of dots there. They're not on my computer, but windmills. And when people look at windmills, they think about a lot of different things. They think about green energy, they think about the environment, they think about engineering. I think about innovation. I see windmills being one of the great innovations of Denmark, for instance. But in order to make the windmills, you have to have a lot of different components. You have to make the motor, you have to have the engineering skills of the people that made them. You also need the basic materials to build them, like stainless steel. And to make stainless steel, you need a lot of raw material. You need chromium, like is displayed up there. You need iron ore, you need silica, nickel, a bunch of different types of raw materials. But the point is that without the raw materials, you wouldn't have the stainless steel, and you wouldn't be able to build the windmills. That's how I see creativity. I see creativity as the raw material for innovation. Because without the raw material, without the cognitive abilities of people, without them coming up with new and useful ways to build innovations, nothing would happen. So that's my standpoint towards creativity. And also just, this is not in my dissertation, this is just to put it into context, but the World Economic Forum recently put out this list of the 10 most important skills for people to have in 2020 for the job requirements to match those. And these are the top 3, so you have complex problem solving, you have critical thinking, and then you have creativity. And I think this is important, and when I look at these 3 skills, I see that they have one thing in common. I think that they are all innately human. So that kind of emphasizes that we need to focus on what is it that humans can do, because now we are going through this 4th industrial revolution with fast-paced technology advancements and all these things. We have robotics, we have artificial intelligence. A lot of people are afraid of all of these changes, but if we use our innately human skills to develop alongside with them and use them to our advantage, creativity being one of them, it can help us adapt to change. Rather than kind of withstanding evolution. So that was that. So now we're at the more introduction level. So first of all, what is creativity? Well, creativity is a basic human skill. It's something that we're all born with. We're all born with a creative potential. Of course, it differs between people. Not everybody has the same potential for creativity, but the point is that we all are creative. And that is an important thing, but the strange thing is that we kind of stop using our full potential the older we get, the more kind of institutionalized we get. We go through educational systems, we become very solution-focused through our jobs and the job market, so we can't really fulfill our creative potential. But if we feel that we're not kind of doing our very best, we can enhance it, we can enhance creativity, we can fulfill our potential again. And we can do that through many means. We can do that through implementing change in educational systems. We can do that by altering things in the environment. whereas I'm interested in these shorter training interventions to enhance creativity, and that's what I have developed in my PhD. And I think that's very important because one facet of creativity is that it's a problem-solving skill in any domain. It's not only reserved for the artists or designers or the creatives, because we're all creative. So when people kind of are able to see it as this problem-solving skill, it's easier to see how you could apply it at other domains. For instance, me as a researcher, I have to be creative. I have to come up with new and useful hypotheses to test or research questions to explore. Detectives have to come up with new and useful ways to catch the bad guy. You always have to be creative. You have to come up with new solutions to tackle problems along the way. So that's important, in my opinion, to emphasize. And then why study creativity? Well, I study creativity because I see it as a hugely practical skill. It's a practical application of creativity that I am studying. I'm kind of trying to separate myself from the arts because artistic creativity exists, but that's not where I'm focusing my work. I'm focusing on the practical application of creativity. And then the next question might be, why study creativity training? Well, in my opinion, and I hope that I made my case, creativity is important. So then, of course, for me, it was a natural way of thinking, how can you enhance it? So my main motivation was to design a creativity training program specifically designed for innovation practitioners, because I saw a lack of those. You have creativity training programs for children, for adolescents, for university students, but there weren't that many available for people that are actually in the job market that would fit their needs. And I aspire to make a rigorous training program for that group of people. Then a second motivation was to contribute to a consensus on how to study creativity training programs, because so creativity training has been around for decades, and it's been studied for decades even. But we've been able to figure out that it works, but we haven't been able to figure out why it works and how it works. What is it that makes creativity training effective? And when I was doing all my reviews of papers, I had a hard time comparing studies because there were methodological inconsistencies, and that inhibits knowledge transfer, which inhibits us from identifying the elements that actually make creativity training programs effective. So this is something that I wanted to kind of contribute to establishing through my PhD. Okay, so the standard definition of creativity. Now we're in the theory section. So this is something that was established in 2012 by Runco, that's sitting right here. But the standard definition, or this combination of original and useful, has been around for decades as well. But there was a lot of confusion. So this was also to kind of establish a consensus about what the definition of creativity is. So creativity is defined as the process of developing something new and original that is somehow useful for a specific function or occasion, thus bringing value to the prospective users or adopters. So you have these two main elements to creativity. It has to be something original, but that's not enough. It also has to be something useful. It has to be appropriate for the task at hand or for the usage. So this is something that I base my work on as well. Then in terms of the larger or broader landscape of creativity, you have a lot of different ways to study creativity. You can study it from an organizational perspective, you can study it from a sociology perspective, systems perspective, whereas my work is situated within the cognitive perspective. I focus on the individual, where I consider ideational thought processes as foundational for creative thought. And because I am also in the business of enhancing creativity, or at least aspiring to, of course I need to measure that somehow. So I also adhere to the psychometric theories of creativity, where I see creativity as a measure that you can actually measure reliably and validly. Then another way to look at creativity is by viewing the 4 Ps of creativity. Or originally they were the 4 Ps, but there have been additions along the way. But these are the original ones that were proposed in 1961. And you have the creative person, you have the cognitive skills and the personality traits that can kind of propel those cognitive skills to a higher level. Then the creative person goes through a creative process, and out of that process comes a creative product. So when you view it like that, it sounds very simple, because it's always good to compartmentalize in order to be able to understand it a little bit better. And then you have the creative press, which is kind of the pressures from the environment. And that kind of encompasses the first three Ps. And the press you can't really do much about, because there's laws and regulations, it's management practices, but knowing about it helps you navigate better through that landscape. So it's useful to look at that. But I position myself within the person and process, and then you have another P there, creative potential, which encompasses those two, and press is actually included in the potential as well, but I delimit myself from looking at that within this particular study. Okay, and then thinking about the cognitive creativity, the individual, this is the cognitive basis of creativity. This is a very simplified illustration of very complex processes that go on in our mind, or in our brains actually. But this is the foundation of creativity. This is what happens in our brains when we're being creative. You have divergent thinking, where you're kind of opening up. You're generating ideas, or you're generating alternatives, you're creating choices, so that's the process of opening up, and then you close down. Then you converge those ideas, alternative or choices, in order to combine them into a solution. And I position my work according to the notion that this goes hand in hand with the standard definition of creativity. So you need those both in order to have creativity. You need to diverge on original ideas in order to be able to combine them into a useful solution. So that's how I see those cognitive processes go hand in hand with the standard definition. Another way to look at it is to see it as a diamond, because that's how it's usually viewed when you look at creativity as operationalized. You have these alternating rounds of divergent and convergent thinking. They might not be as big. You have many different rounds, but this particular combination could easily be combined with, for instance, this very simplified illustration of the innovation process, where you have the fuzzy front end kind of constituting one diamond, opening up and closing down. Then you have new product development, which is another diamond, and then you have commercialization, which is a diamond of its own. This is a very simplified illustration, but it's just to kind of put it into context. And then, of course, within these diamonds, you have a lot of smaller iterative rounds of diverging and converging. But I think this is kind of useful in order to kind of grasp what this is all about. That brings me to creativity training. That is, of course, the main focus of my research. And in 2004, Scott and colleagues published this paper. I think it's safe to say that it's quite seminal by now, where they did a meta-analysis of 70 creativity training programs in order to identify or analyze their both content and delivery. But what I took from that was that they also proposed this optimal format for creativity training, where they proposed 4 different elements that should kind of contribute to an effective creativity training program. And first, they say that the training should be built on a theoretical foundation on the cognitive basis of creativity. And then secondly, the theoretical training should actually be a substantial part of the overall training, overall length of the training. And then thirdly, they emphasized that it should happen in a cooperative learning environment, and that they should work on cases, real-world cases. And then finally, of course, you need to introduce them to different exercises and tools in order for them to actually practice working and utilizing their theoretical training. And then the final big concept in my theory section, which is metacognition. So metacognition is a concept known very well within psychology field, and this is something that kind of came in unexpectedly to my program, to my study. But anyways, I'll explain that a little bit better, but so I won't delve very deep into this, but I just want to kind of explain what metacognition is. So it's this system, it's overarching system in our brains that provides this ongoing overview of our cognitions, and it helps direct the way we work. It's basically thinking about thinking. So the easiest way to explain it is this tip of the tongue phenomena. You meet someone, you know that you should know their name. You know that you should know. You're thinking about your own thinking. So that's, in a very, very simplified way, explaining what metacognition is. Metacognition has these three different facets. So you have metacognitive knowledge, which is your knowledge about your cognitions. For instance, you know you have memory. And then let's say that you would meet someone and you would have to remember a phone number. And you wouldn't have a smartphone and you wouldn't have anything to write it down on, which of course would never happen in modern society, I guess. But anyways, you're in a position where you have to remember a phone number. So you know you have to use your memory. That's metacognitive knowledge. Then you try to remember the phone number and you figure, okay, this is not going to happen. So you are monitoring yourself. And then you think, okay, I actually should use a technique that has worked very well for me in remembering things, and I'll assign colors to the numbers in order for me to remember them. That's when you use your metacognitive control. So that's kind of how it works. You have this meta level, and then you have all these cognitions. Here would, for instance, be memory, and then monitoring kind of feeds the meta level. It kicks into place, and it kind of uses the control to regulate the cognition. So that's it. Now, enough of theory. So having all of this theoretical background leads me to the overall research aim, which is quite big and covers a lot of things, so I'll just read it out loud to you. So the overall aim was to investigate how innovation practitioners utilize creativity in their everyday work, how they can be trained in the most optimized manner, and what the consequences are of facilitating them through a creativity training program developed to fit their expertise and needs. And as I said, this is a broad aim. So of course, in order to reach the aim, you have to specify research objectives that make it a bit more operationalized. So that actually, these research objectives ended up dictating the 3 stages of my PhD. So these three levels constitute 1 year of my PhD. So I spent 1 year trying to investigate what should I train? What is relevant for innovation practitioners to train? How are they creative in their processes? So what should I emphasize? What is important in the real world? Then secondly, I wanted to investigate how to train, where I wanted to develop a program, figure out how to train through multiple means. And then finally, after having developed the program, I wanted to test it. I wanted to see what are the effects. Is it relevant for innovation practitioners? Is it effective in increasing the creative potential of the participants? And here, I'm not going to go through this, but this is just to show that each research objective had a corresponding overarching research question for each of the stages. Then we had several research questions that were addressed through one of the 6 articles in the study, or one of the 6 studies. So in order to answer all of these diverse research questions, the chosen methodology for the overall project was mixed method, because each and every research question called for different types of methods to answer them. So here you can see the first year was mainly qualitative, where I did case studies. So the first one, I actually spent 6 months with innovation practitioners. I was ingrained into their life. I was there full day, every day, observing them to see how they were working and how they interacted. Then I did another smaller case study. And then when I finally got to the how to train stage, I of course did a systematic review of all existing or creativity training programs. Then I did a transdisciplinary study that I'll get back to. And then I did an experiment as well that fit in with that, where I was testing one of the elements that was actually in the training program. And then finally, the final year was spent on figuring out what are the effects of the training, where I did a small-scale experiment, and I also did a pilot study with innovation practitioners to look at the relevance of the program to them. So I'm going to focus in on this, because case studies, reviews, experiments, they're pretty straightforward, whereas transdisciplinary study within academia to collect data is quite novel. So I'll go through that particular study. So transdisciplinary is a discipline that includes interdisciplinary but goes a step further and transcends the margin of science. And this is something that it's used in strategic foresight. I found this, it's one of Christian's papers. Yeah, and Birgitte, yes. And I adapted that methodology or that method to develop the training program, or at least to gather data for me to be able to develop the program, because I figured that I wanted to include actors in the process that were not only scientists. I wanted to get real-world perspectives and get their opinions in order to first assure relevancy, and then I also wanted to ensure that the program would be rigorous, so I did a workshop with innovation practitioners, academics, and finally HR managers to ensure, or at least aspire to make it realistic, what is appropriate for an organizational perspective. So these are the three. I actually have some of the participants from these workshops here, so that's fun to see. Yeah, so that's what I did in order to gather data to develop the program. So I did all this preliminary mapping in the first year. Then I did this in a co-creation process where I first did 3 interventions or workshops with these stakeholder groups, because I wanted to get their needs and perspectives into the mix. And then I drafted up the first proposal or first sketch of the program, and I took that to 2 experts to get feedback on pedagogical perspectives and also program design and so on, to kind of see if what I had come up with would make any sense at all. And out of all that came the metacognitive training for innovation practitioners. So it was actually a culmination of 2 years worth of work into making this program. And that brings me to the results. They will be threefold. I'll first introduce process awareness, which is a concept that I developed in my first year. Then out of the transdisciplinary study came the no recognize react model, and of course the training program itself. So I'll introduce these 3 to you. First, we have process awareness. That's where the metacognition comes into play, because process awareness is the skill that I observed the innovation practitioners display when they were working in a process, where they were being aware of their process, they were monitoring themselves when they were working, and they knew what could potentially inhibit them in a process or help them propel further. So it was this basic knowledge that they had. They had a lot of experience, of course, where they were being observant about their work, and then they deployed either tactics or strategies to navigate and to facilitate their process. So this was interesting to see, and I think about it as it's thinking about creative thinking. So they were kind of focusing on how they could advance in their processes. Process awareness, I observed it as being split into these 3 different types. So you have planning process awareness, which occurs before or prior to initiating a process. So it's when you're planning a process, either a co-creation process, a workshop, whatever it is, where you're thinking, okay, we shouldn't prime them in that sense, or we don't want to add too many constraints here and there. So that's kind of when you're actively discussing things that might affect you, cognitive processes or creativity-related aspects that might help you or inhibit you when you are in a workshop. Monitoring is something that happens simultaneously, so that's when the team is actually working. That's when they are observing them, and one might say, oh, stop, we shouldn't be in solution mode now, we should be opening up. So then they're kind of talking about we should be diverging, we shouldn't be converging right now. Or oh, I'm getting so fixated, I think I need a break. Something like that, where they're kind of verbalizing what they are doing. And then reflection kind of explains itself. That's when they were afterwards talking about what worked, what didn't work, what could we do better next time. So that's kind of reflecting and drawing learnings from what they had been doing. And as I see it, so process awareness is a metacognitive concept, but it fits underneath the umbrella of metacognition. So metacognition covers everything, whereas process awareness is more process-oriented, especially creative process-oriented, but not necessarily exactly only that. Then out of the transdisciplinary study came this know, recognize, react model. So I wanted to train people in becoming better at process awareness. That was the main goal for the training. Then I had to figure out how to do that. And this model came to be where I figured, okay, I want participants to be able to know about these things that can affect them. So I have to give them knowledge about these creativity, cognitive processes and concepts that might affect their work. Then I also want them to be able to recognize them when they actually happen. I want them to be able to see, okay, this is happening now, because that's the only way to trigger a reaction. Because I also want them to be able to react appropriately when they encounter things that can either inhibit them or stop them, or even say, okay, we should do this because that would be better. So that's the basic thought. And these 3 levels were inspired by the 3 facets of metacognition, but I say inspired because they definitely do not correspond to them, but that's how the idea came to be. Then, of course, I developed the training program. This is the schedule, and this schedule was a product of the workshop with the HR managers, where it was very clear that the program could not be more than 2 days if it were supposed to be deployed in organizational settings. So I had to think, okay, how can I compress it as much as I can without compromising the content or the exercises? So I ended up splitting it up into 6 sessions, and then they had pre-learning material that they had to watch, so videos before showing up, which were about 1 hour. And I did this with just under 100 people. It was very inspiring, and I learned a lot from it. This is the content of the program. So you have these 6 sessions. So first I kind of educated them about metacognition and process awareness. So this is what I want you to keep in mind throughout the program, and we had several different exercises for that. Then in the second session we had the cognitive creativity, where we covered divergent thinking, convergent thinking, and associations. Then we talked about the 5 key concepts of neurocreativity, which are these concepts like priming, fixation, things that can kind of influence you when you're doing your creative work. Then we covered constraint management. Then we covered the problem and solution spaces, and then finally we ended up in the divergent and convergent stages of the operationalized process. So the one that I showed you with the diamonds. So we started out quite kind of cognitively focused, but we got a bit more process oriented the further we got in the program. And now I just want to show you one example of an exercise, because not only did the know, recognize, react model inspire the learning objectives for the program, but it also was ingrained into the design of the exercises. So here, for example, is an associations exercise, where I put up this slide for the participants. I hope you can see this. And I asked them to go to pages 29 to 35, because they had gotten these booklets, and they are A-type and B-type. And there's a reason for that. So I asked them to go to these pages, and these booklets contained all of the templates and all of the material they would use throughout the course. So they had these, they went to their pages, and then they got these, where I asked them to list 5 close associations to these 3 words. So for dance, they had, for instance, music, happy, activity, going out, fun. Then they would go down to party, where it would be party hat, drinking game, birthday, friends, festive. And then finally they would have club, where they would have dancing, music, DJ, bass, drinks. So these are the associations from booklet A. B, on the other hand, they got these words. So it was football, then it was players, game, ball, goal, winning. Field, then it was grass, green, square, big, football. And then for club, it was Manchester United, Wayne Rooney, loyalty, red, Premier League. Obviously a football fan there. But the point here is that they had the same bottom words, but they had completely different associations to each and every one of them, because they had been primed by the words that were on top. And that was something that I wanted them to realize by themselves. So I asked them subsequently to pair up with a person from the opposite, with the opposite booklet, and compare. Like, look at the words that you've been doing and compare, especially the bottom words. After they did that, then I wanted them to reflect individually to activate the know stage of the model. I always, after each exercise, gave them key concepts to use or to assist them in their reflection. So those were the concepts that we had been covering. And then I asked them to kind of reflect on, so which of these concepts did you experience? How much of them? Did you experience both? Is there a difference? No, is there a difference? That's of course between the booklets, because then subsequently I asked them to pair up, and then I wanted them to talk about, have you ever encountered this in your work? Why is there a difference? Can you kind of, so I asked them to kind of delve a little bit deeper into what's the meaning of all of this. And then we had an in plenum or a group discussion where we talked about different types of strategies and ways to tackle this in the real world, try to connect it to real world situations where they had encountered it themselves. And there I kind of wanted to educate them or give them tools to be able to react accordingly if they would ever encounter this. And for instance, with priming, it's just being aware that everything in your environment affects you. And that's an important realization, I think, for people to be aware of. Okay, and now we're shifting gears a little bit. So assessing creativity training. So I told you that I did the systematic review of creativity training programs. This was the research question for that study. I wanted to figure out which elements make one effective training program more effective than the other, because I wanted to see what is it that makes creativity training effective. But when I started my analysis and I had listed everything up, I realized that I couldn't really compare them. I couldn't compare the results because the research designs were so diverse. Not everybody did the basic methodological requirements that you need when you do an experiment, and so I couldn't really see what I could gain from that, other than just inspiration, of course, from the program and like those types of learnings. But from like the concrete results, it was difficult for me at least to accept a lot of them. So I thought, well, if we want to advance our knowledge about what makes creativity training effective, we need to have a consensus. We need to have some sort of an agreement on how to study creativity training program. So this article actually ended up being some sort of a methodological recommendation paper where I suggested this 3 criteria for studying creativity training, because and this is just pretty basic in terms of like methodological recommendations. So pre and post testing. You need to have pre and post testing to be able to see if something was effective, right? You have to have a control group, but you have to give them the same attention as the treatment group, because otherwise you can't say it was actually your program or your intervention that made a difference. And then of course you have to have a sufficient sample size in order to, for your results to be reliable. So this was the 3 criteria that I suggested. And then in the same paper I also suggested a definition for creativity training program, because I couldn't find that anywhere. So this ended up being more of a theoretical paper than an analysis or a review. And then of course that guided me when I then designed the experiment for testing my own program. So I did pre and post testing. I used a battery of tests for both pre and post. I did the alternate uses test, which is a typical divergent thinking test. Then I did the remote associates test, which is a commonly used convergent thinking test. And then for assessing metacognition, because I also wanted to investigate that, I used the metacognitive awareness inventory. And then for the control group, I made these videos for the pre-learning material. So I actually used the pre-learning material to dictate my conditions. So the treatment group, they got the theory. So I recorded these 8 video lectures, and that I asked them to watch before entering the program, so that they would be familiarized with the theoretical concepts we would be covering. And then the control group got more motivational talks. So it was 4 TED Talks: Ken Robinson, David Kelly, Astro Teller, and Paul Bennett, kind of famous people working with design and design thinking. So it was more like motivational. There was no theory in there, because I wanted to test if the theory was essential, if that element is what helps creativity training be effective. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get a sufficient sample size. That was very disappointing. But I am planning more data collection now in March, where I will add more data, which will help me get more statistical results. But these are the preliminary results, which at least motivate me to keep going and then actually collect more data. Because the treatment group, or the people that got the theoretical pre-learning material, they increased their creativity while the control group did not. And the same for metacognition. So the treatment group increased, whereas the control group did not. There is a positive correlation between creativity and metacognition for the whole sample. So when you are better at creativity, you are also better at metacognition. But the correlation appeared to be stronger for the treatment group. So there were higher chance, or the relationship was stronger. So this helps me at least keep motivated and wanting to collect more data. And of course, I will also try to add a third control group, because the flaw in my study was that I tested the pre-learning material without testing it against another program. So that's something that I'm also considering if I can implement into the new research design or the additions. And then to the contributions. So now we've covered process awareness, the no recognize react model, and the criteria. So these three are all kind of contributions to expanding our body of knowledge. Also the definition of creativity training program that I didn't include there, but that was in the same paper as the three criteria. And then I did this experiment where I tested the timing of constraints, because that was one of the sessions in the program to train constraint management. And then ultimately testing an element of the creativity training to understand better, to contribute to understanding what makes creativity training effective. So if we go back to the initial motivations for the program that I introduced in the beginning. So my initial motivation was to design a creativity training program for innovation practitioners. And I believe that I achieved that through these studies, where I did these exploratory studies, where I first developed process awareness, and then the transdisciplinary study, where I developed the model plus the program itself. And then this initial motivation to contribute to a consensus, which I hope that I at least have done in some slight way by introducing a definition of creativity training program, and also introducing these three criteria that I am hoping will kind of help people conduct studies so that we can learn better from each other. And for my future research, I of course want to continue study the elements of creativity training programs. And I also want to assess the training program not only short-term, but on a more longitudinal manner, to see, okay, there might be some immediate effects, but do they stay? Do you keep them? Or do you lose them after some time? I think that's a very interesting thing to look at. I also want to investigate the effects of process awareness, because as of now, it's only a theory. It's something that I theorize as being a positive thing. But I would like to study that in more detail. And then also I think it's interesting to kind of think about what is it that receiving creativity training does for your surroundings. If one person in a 5-person team has received creativity training, do they become kind of champions? Do they teach the others? Does it have some sort of an impact on the work environment? I think that's also something that's interesting to look at. But what I first and foremost aspire to do is to figure out what is the sweet spot of creativity training. This is a very conceptual model, but this is just kind of what my aspirations are, to see if you have creative potential on the y-axis and time spent on training on the x-axis, to see where is the steepest curve, where do you get the most gain, where do you increase your creative potential most versus time spent. Because we're living in a fast-paced world, everybody's very busy, our time is very precious, so of course you need to find effective ways with the least amount of time. So that's something that we can figure out if we continue to study the elements of creativity training and what actually makes one training program better than the other. So this is what I want to do. And that was it for me. Thank you for your attention.